the Speak, episode 35. Unique New York. Unique New York.
Do you kick ass when you speak, present, or pitch? If not, these expert discussions and insider tips can help you right now, today. Welcome to the What the Speak podcast. I'm your host, Brian Kelly.
Struggling with feeling comfortable in front of an audience when you present? Or maybe you're confident, but you have difficulty stumbling over filler words like and ah. Well, you can start kicking ass today by signing up for our weekly VIP updates. As a bonus, you'll also receive 11 free tips that will uncover 6 psychological secrets to public speaking, plus 5 tips on how to stop using filler words. Go to whatthespeak.com/VIP. Rohit Bhargava, are you ready to answer the question, what the speak?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right. So Rohit, I know that you're a marketing expert, a best-selling author, a professor at Georgetown University, and you're also a keynote speaker who's graced the TedX stage multiple times. But let's hear it directly from you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Well, I look at what I try and do every day as inspire better marketing. And I think that better marketing is one of those few forces that can change the world. And it probably seems like an obvious thing for a marketing guy to say, because we all love what we do, or at least I hope we do. Yep. But for me, like the people who are going to change the world, the reason they fail is because of bad marketing, usually. And so people like me who, for a living, try and help others tell their stories, I think the world needs people like that. And I think marketing, a lot of times, it gets a bad rap because it doesn't seem like the goal is that noble, right? I mean, it kind of seems like we're just trying to sell people stuff. And sometimes that stuff is unhealthy or bad for the world, or just, focused on making somebody some money. And I think marketing can be bigger than that. So that's what I try and do.
I agree. I mean, well, first off, I have a marketing background as well as a design background. So I know a lot of designers that I know say, well, design can change the world.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
I like this direction that you're going. Marketing can change the world too. And it really does depend on what you're marketing and how you're marketing it. But I think, the shift that we're seeing in the 21st century, or at least the early part of the 21st century, is really getting to connecting people that are looking for something, or maybe they don't know that they're looking for it, but it's going to help them, and essentially helping them answer those challenges, those problems, et cetera, that they have.
Yeah, and I think there is there's an appetite now more than ever with all of the information that's out there for people to take that. You almost can consider them a chief explaining officer, right? Like somebody who just explains stuff in a way that other people can understand and be inspired by. Yeah. And, some people might say, well, that's just leadership. But I think it's a little bit different. I mean, it's not just being a leader. It's the ability to take something that some people don't necessarily either understand or believe in and turn it into something that they do.
Exactly. Yeah, I recently had a guest on the show that's an expert in leadership. And it's interesting that a lot of these things kind of coalesce or dovetail into each other, that in order to be a good leader, you've got to be an effective communicator.
Right.
And when you're an effective communicator, you're in essence a good leader, or somebody that people look to for information, for answers, for direction.
Yeah, and a lot of what my research has been, and actually what I've written about in books, is this idea that we connect with people on a personal level, and we overestimate how much the sort of bullet points of skill or background or degrees make a difference. Yeah. And when it comes down to real life, we actually believe in, and a lot of times we follow the person that we like more than anything else.
Yep.
And it's all about personal connection.
Absolutely. Well, Rohit, let's talk a little bit about when you get up on stage and talk before a group of people, or if it's at the front of the room even, what are the topics or topic that you typically speak on?
Well, one of the big things that I do a lot of speaking on now is trends. So what's going to happen, what's sort of around the corner. And I hate the idea of prediction, which often gets associated with trends, because a lot of people think, well, you're just predicting something which might or might not come true. Whereas I think really great trend work is all about curating what's already happening and then saying, well, this is going to keep happening more often. And that's really what a trend is. It's not like I think that somebody's going to invent a flying car next year and I hope it happens, right? Like that's not a trend. That's like a hope. Whereas like a real trend is, these 5 companies are all working in this space and here's the umbrella message for what that means for the world. So every year I do an annual trend report and I launch it at sort of the end of the year. So I'm actually just like a week or two away from launching my 2014 trend report. And it really kind of looks at what's going to be happening in the next year. So I do a lot of speaking around that.
Perfect. Well, let's transition to the part of our discussion where we talk about your origin story as a speaker. Would love to see if you can explain to us the story, the journey of how you got into public speaking and ultimately now the place where you're at as a professional speaker that's regularly being hired to speak at keynote opportunities or keynote events.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my path was I'd say was an escalating path. So, the place that I started was I used to work for a big marketing agency, Ogilvy. And so part of my job was to kind of go out there at conferences. And what I started doing is joining panels. And, as soon as I got on panels, I kind of learned a lot about how speaking works and how most panels suck. And that kind of gave me a unique perspective. And so I pretty quickly said, well, I don't want to be on a panel that sucks. And the only way I can control that is if I moderate the panel. So I graduated, so to speak, from being on a panel to moderating a panel. And pretty soon I started to build a reputation as one of the few moderators of panels that didn't suck. And, that led me into getting higher and higher profile deals. And I think one thing that that really helped me when it came time to make that jump from speaker to keynote speaker, there's 2 things that helped me. One was publishing a book. I mean, that definitely makes a difference. So I published my first book in 2008 that was called Personality Not Included. And as soon as you're an author, it's kind of like you can more easily get into that. But the other thing that really helped me was being in a keynote slot as the interviewer of someone more famous. So, for example, I did a keynote for Blog World, I think in like 2008 or 2009, where on stage I interviewed Tim Ferriss and Mike Shinoda from Linkin Park. Yeah. So, because I was a keynote speaker, technically I was the guy interviewing the real celebrities.
Interesting.
But I was a keynote speaker. I did the same thing when I interviewed Craig from Craigslist.
Right.
He's the draw. Everybody knows Craig. And I was the guy interviewing him. And that sort of got me into that level. And then as soon as I had the book and I could say I'd already done some keynote speaking, it was just a simple path, I think, from that point to say, now you're a keynote speaker.
Okay, so there's a couple of things that I want to break down here with you. So we'll circle back a little bit. The first thing I wanted to ask you was, in your opinion, on those panels that you were participating in and even observing other panel discussions, what about those suck? I mean, I think a lot of us kind of have our own opinions about it, but I'd love to hear your opinion. What about the panel is something that can be, turn out to be not such a great thing?
Yeah, I think, the one thing that they all, that made them all universally suck in the same way was that the moderator would basically pose an obvious question and they'd wait for every single panelist to answer that exact same question. And when you ask an obvious question, you get an obvious answer. And when you ask an obvious question of 4 people, you get 4 obvious answers that are all the same. And that's what makes a panel suck, because everybody agrees and there's no different perspective.
Yeah.
And so what I started doing is first of all, I did more research on who the panelists were, where they worked, and what they did. But then I actually directed questions, and it was more like a one-on-one interview with each person that then brought into a panel because they all related to one another. And that ended up making the panels much better. And then the other thing I really tried to do is I tried to get a sense of who the audience was. And as soon as a panelist said something that seemed like I should probe further, I did, what you're doing. I interviewed them. And when they said something that was kind of interesting, then I would ask the next question after that. And I think a lot of times in panels, moderators don't do that.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I mean, I think just kind of reflecting on what you shared, it's kind of obvious. Like when you think about it, if I ask the same question to the same people and it's an obvious question, I'm going to get the obvious answer. Makes for a really boring presentation. And just making a little twist, a little tweak to how you're asking those questions can make a tremendous difference. And I selfishly wanted to know because sometime in the early part of next year, I'm actually going to be moderating a panel discussion. So it's my first time moderating it. And so I wanted to get your inside tip on that.
Yeah, I have a whole blog post. I'll send it to you, but it's basically, how I moderate panels, or how to moderate a panel that doesn't suck, I think is what I called the blog post.
Love it.
And now, one of the nice things I do is every time when I'm moderating a panel, I actually send that blog post to all the panelists. And I say, here's how I'm going to moderate, which is a trick I learned from Guy Kawasaki, because when he moderates a panel, like he's got a blog post that he wrote about his philosophy for moderating. And he'll just send that blog post to every panelist, and he'll say, here's what I'm going to do.
Nice.
Which is way better than saying, here's the 5 questions I'm going to ask you, and then following a script.
Cool. Well, you guys heard it here first. Rohit's got the inside track on moderating a panel.
And it's interesting because I think, just thinking about that, what you asked about the escalating levels, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, like moderating a panel has now graduated into like emceeing an event, which is a different kind of keynoting, right? Because the typical keynote speaker is like, you go up for an hour, all eyes are on you. You got to be entertaining. You got to do what you do. And I do that also. Yeah. But it's a different skill set to say, okay, I'm going to MC an event. It's not about me. I got to keep things moving. I got to be friendly and entertaining, but I got to also get out of the way and keep stuff going. And I don't think that there's a lot of people who can kind of interchangeably do either or. And so I think for the audience that's listening and watching this, you may have a better skill set as a moderator / MC person than you may as a keynote speaker. And I think that there are more and more situations where that's needed. So part of it is just being honest with yourself and saying, look, what's my sweet spot? Like, what am I really good at?
Well, the other question I had for you as a follow-up was I did want to ask, just to clarify, you were saying that you started with doing these moderating keynote type things. Did that come before your first book in 2008, or was that something that came after?
I'm not sure I remember. I think, definitely moderating panels came before the book. But emceeing entire events, I don't think I necessarily needed a book for that. I think that was one of those things where you just kind of, it's like you're on a football team and you're the running back, but you happen to like catch a couple balls and people are like, "Oh, you can catch," and then they're like, "Okay, now we're going to hire you to do that too." So I kind of fell into the whole emceeing thing as a side thing. I mean, my main thing for a long time was do the piece of thinking that generate the book or the idea that generates the 1 hour keynote on trends or building trust or storytelling or whatever it is, right? Like,
Very cool. All right, so I'd love to explore what's like a particular challenge that you've had going back to maybe those early days of you first getting into this, or even things that now today, you feel like you struggle with and that you want to work on and continue to improve.
Well, one of the things that I always thought, and this was kind of in my head more than it was a reality, how sometimes things are like, you're like, this is the way it is. And then like you kind of get into the real world and you're like, wait a second, maybe not. Yeah. And one of the things that I always thought was like a big benefit of hiring me as a keynote speaker, and I would always use this in my pitch, right? And I would put it on my website, is I customize everything, right? So I'll go into a keynote and I'll customize my approach and I'll talk about this, but I'll use relevant examples and I'll do this and I'll do that. And I always thought that's what they want, right? Yeah. I mean, who wouldn't want something customized? And then I started thinking about that a little bit more deeply. And I was like, when Katy Perry goes on Leno, right? They don't want her to sing a new song. Right. They want her to sing the same song, because they know that's the song that everybody loves and they've seen it before and they like it. And that's why they're inviting her. And, for me, like that realization moment, literally while I was sitting there watching Katy Perry, and I'm like, she's singing the same thing the same way. And I'm like, but everybody loves it. I'm like, well, maybe part of what the person booking speakers actually wants is predictability, right? That's what it comes down to, because they've seen you before, they've seen videos. And if you say, I'm going to do something new, you lessen the predictability, and that may not be a good thing. And I always thought that was a great thing, because who wouldn't want personalization, right? Yeah. So for me, this has been like a big shift this year to kind of understand that, look, sometimes people want the thing. And even if it's the same thing, and you as a speaker might personally be bored by that, right? Like, I don't like doing the same presentation over and over again. No. But at the end of the day, like, if they're going to pay you really good money to show up and do the talk, they kind of want the talk.
That's interesting. Have you gone like one step further to kind of verify that, that thought, that idea that you have, and get input from meeting planners or those that would hire you?
Yeah, it's funny. I just did a speaking gig at a private event for a huge law firm, and and they had maybe like 1,000 of their partners from everywhere, and the woman who hired me for that had seen me speak at an industry conference, and I gave a similar talk because it was about Lyconomics, my last my kind of book that came out last year, which is all about why we do business with people that we like. And so that was the topic, which kind of made sense for lawyers, right? Because it's like you got to be likable as a lawyer. Right. It was like a blow your mind kind of idea, right? But when I did that talk, and afterwards, she was giving me feedback, right? And she was like, "I love the talk; it was really good. I was really bummed that you didn't use that story about so and so that she'd seen in the previous presentation, right? So here's real time feedback from somebody who said, "Look, I hired you because I loved you on stage, and by the way, I love that one story." Yeah. And I really wanted that story to be in the presentation to my people. And I'm bummed that it didn't make it, right? So she did want the same talk. I mean, that's what I read from that comment, right? She wanted the same stories, maybe not the exact same talk. Right. But that was a story that she really latched onto. And a lot of times, like, what a lot of speakers will find is your speaking gigs come from when people see you, and then they say, "Oh, I want that guy to come to my own thing," right? Mm-hmm. And that's what happened in this case. But she had a very specific thing in her head. She said, "Oh, I want that guy because I love these particular stories."
Yeah.
Right.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
All right, Rohit, I want to transition now to talking about your unique expert perspective. And one of the things I did want to ask you was related to what you teach your students at Georgetown about how to be what you describe as a non-boring speaker. What are some of the ways that you teach your students how to go about, being engaging when they're in front of a group of people? Any little tips or tricks that you can share on that?
Yeah, it's for a lot of them, the type of speaking, and I actually have an entire class, one of the classes that we spend. So my class is all about global marketing, so it's not really about speaking, but as part of the class, as you might expect, like, I do teach them speaking because I think it's an important skill that they're going to use. And a lot of the speaking that they learn, and this may relate to some of the folks who are listening, is not necessarily being the keynote speaker on stage, but presenting or pitching an idea in order to, sell it to somebody or to be part of a group that's pitching something. That's the type of speaking that they're doing. And so a lot of the feedback and what I try and teach them is some of the skills that really make that valuable. So one is, how do you put together a story? How do you storyboard out, like, step 1, step 2, step 3? I mean, I'm literally sitting here, like, I have all these index cards, like, on my desk, like, literally, because I'm scripting out what the trends are going to be, and I very visually kind of storyboard stuff out. I mean, here, I'll show you, like, this is, like, one of my things, right? Like, that's how I do it.
I do the same exact thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like, a lot of people do that, right? Yep. But that's not a typical skill set for a university master's level student. Like, nobody teaches them that, right? Yeah. So a lot of what I do is I teach them about the process of storyboarding. I'm very influenced by Hollywood. I used to have aspirations of wanting to be a screenwriter. In my background, I've always been a writer, so screenwriting was like a really powerful thing that helped with my philosophy. So that's one thing I teach them. And the other thing I teach them is the dynamics of presenting with other people. Even down to, like, kind of the hard basic rules, which is, in a pitch situation, when you do your pitch and a client asks a question, no more than 2 people should ever answer, because now you're just listening to yourself talk and you're not giving them the chance to ask the next question. So it's, part of it is like selling, part of it is speaking. It's kind of like this combination of skills. But I think if they follow those things, then their pitches become better, which is a form of speaking, right? And their ability to convince someone in a compelling way to do something is better as well.
Are you typically teaching like business students?
Most of the students I've had so far have been Masters of Communications students. So at Georgetown, there's a Masters of Communications degree that's actually outside of the business school. So they have business backgrounds and they all go into business careers, but it's not part of an MBA program.
Perfect. Okay, the other thing I wanted to ask you was, I know there are a lot of speakers, a lot of presenters out there, but I want to ask you, what do you personally think makes a speaker stand out? What's the thing that typically will help them differentiate themselves from others that might be speaking on a similar topic? Any insights that you have on that particular aspect?
I think for me, it's been a combination of approachability in speaking. And what I mean by that is not just like your time off stage and being able to interact with people and then that part of it, but also just people can tell when you present on stage whether you're an approachable person or not. And based on that, they kind of decide whether they're going to give you their attention or not. And it's kind of like chemistry between a speaker and an audience, right? And we've all seen it when it happens, and we've all seen it when it doesn't. And it's not about the content, right? It's not about the delivery, right? It's about being able to personally connect in a, and I hate to use the cliche word authentic way, but I mean, it kind of is. Like, that's kind of what it is. And, my business card, literally, it says speaker, author, nice guy. That's what the business card says. Because, like, I'm living my own personality there, right? And I think that's part of the reason that people pay attention to you and want to listen to you. And that's been a key for me in terms of, like, the delivery and being able to connect with people. Mm-hmm. In terms of the other part of your question about like what sets a speaker apart, what sets them, outside of the usual speaker. I think there's the side of the audience, right? So like what makes an audience think, oh my God, that guy was amazing. And then there's the, working with the speaking planner and like, oh my God, what made him so amazing to work with, right? A lot of people focus on the audience part. They're like, if I just have great stories and I'm really entertaining, people will walk away and they'll be like, whoa. And for me, like the key for a lot of the talks that I do is a combination of inspiration / entertainment, right? Which is like somebody's really like they're sitting. I mean, I consider it a victory if somebody's like so engaged that they forget to take notes, right? Like that's good. You want them to just be like, oh my God, I forgot to take notes. You were so good, right? But at the same time, like you want to leave them with like, okay, what do I do with that? Like, what do I do next? And so like the guy who is blind and climbed Himalaya, the Himalayan mountains, like that's an amazing story, but like you're not going to go and do that, right? So it's just kind of like you can do it, but that's it. And a lot of my background has been like I'm a consulting guy. I've done this stuff in real, in the real world, and I've kind of made it work. And so part of what I want to leave people with is like, here's the 3 things that you do differently tomorrow. So yes, inspiration, but also like action. And I think that's really important, and that also kind of sets speakers apart because a lot of times, like when it comes to the large events, like the 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people events, my sweet spot is going to be the 3rd keynote speaker, right? So they already have like Hillary Clinton. They already have like, some crazy, the Himalaya dude, right? But the 3rd guy is like somebody from the industry, somebody who's like going to be really entertaining, but is going to actually give you like real actionable stuff. Yeah. And that's that's me. Like that's the slot that I want to fit into.
Very cool. All right, Rohit, we're going to wrap things up with our rapid fire Q&A portion.
Okay, this is going to be good.
The first question I'm going to ask you is, do you prefer slides or no slides?
Depends on the audience. I think some audiences it's way better with visuals. I'm not a never use slides kind of guy. But if it's more casual, then it's way better with no slides.
I agree. There's a time and a place for everything, right?
Yeah. There's no time and place for bullet points, though.
Right. Yeah, avoid that. If you haven't gotten wise to that by now, this is your time. This is your moment to realize no bullet point lists.
Yeah. Even if you have a list, just don't put the bullet points on it, yes. Right? How easy is that?
And maybe break them up between a few different slides.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to also ask, who's one speaker that inspires you the most and why?
This is probably an obvious answer, but I think Bill Clinton is just an amazing speaker to watch. And I think it is because of that affability, that approachability. Like, he could be explaining to you why paint dries in 20 minutes as opposed to 25 minutes. You'd be like, whoa, that's amazing. That guy's really good.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's a speaker. I mean, that's somebody who could just take anything and make it interesting.
Cool. What's the craziest, funniest, silliest, bizarre thing that maybe has happened to you on stage when in front of an audience?
Well, I was at an event where it wasn't me, but I think this classifies as crazy and bizarre. One of the guys who was speaking, like, everybody kind of knew him, and so as a joke, they created these like cartoon head versions of his head that were like, this much bigger than his head, and they were all on sticks. And at a point in the middle of his speech, they just played this really loud, like, kind of music. And like 20 people all stormed the stage with like sticks of his head in the middle of his talk.
That is bizarre.
And then they all went on stage. That was probably the strangest thing I've seen on stage.
Hilarious. Okay, so I wanted to also ask, somebody that's come from a background of not only verbal communication, but visual communication, being able to master those skills, what's the impact been on your career to this date?
Well, I'm not sure I'm a master of it even now, right? But I think that design thinking and visual thinking has been huge. And that's actually something I try and teach my students, that you don't have to be an artist in order to think visually. And actually, we all already think visually. It's just we have to appreciate that. And once you appreciate it, then you start to draw out things, and it impacts the way that you design slides. The other thing that I use on a very specific logistical level is I teach from a great book called Slideology from Nancy Duarte. I think you might have even had her on your show before. And she's great. And that book is like literally a handbook for creating great slides. And so if you are at that point where, a lot of speakers get to, where like your content's good, you've been working on your delivery, but you're just not happy with the look of your slides. I mean, obviously you could go and hire a designer. And that's probably the smart thing to do. Actually, I've done that myself now. Like, I have somebody working on my entire brand identity right now because I've realized that I have so many different things, and and I'm a branding and marketing guy, but we can't do everything ourselves, right? You got to know what you're not good at. But I think if you are going to start by kind of changing around the way that you present visually, that's a great book to pick up. It's really, really, I highly recommend it.
It is great. Well, Rohit, what's one piece of advice that you would share with somebody who's just getting started? Over the years that you've been doing this, some of the lessons that you've learned, what's something that you wish you would have known that you would pass along to someone else?
I would say that the biggest thing that's been helpful for me, that I maybe started a little bit late, but pays off for every talk that I do, is I literally have a collection I have a story collection. And what I do when I create this story collection is I tear stuff out of magazines and stick it in folders. But usually I search for visuals and I save those visuals around stories. And so now I have this like PowerPoint. It's literally a PowerPoint presentation, and it has 800 slides in it. Wow. And all of those are just images of stories. And so now when I do a new talk, I can find a story from that, and I can pull like a picture of a Swedish king if I'm going to talk about that story from 400 years ago. And I'm a big history buff. Like, I love applying lessons from 400 years ago to what's happening today and using that to create interest. So like, sometimes I'll start a talk with like the history of cinnamon. Sometimes I'll talk about like, the Swedish king building this ship that sank in the harbor, and what you can learn from that. And so, a lot of times like those stories, by collecting those, that's been a really helpful thing for me, because when I'm putting together a new presentation, I can bring in a lot of different things. And it's especially valuable when you start doing like international keynotes, because now you want to start bringing in examples that aren't just, you don't want to be the guy who walks in and says, hey, here's what's happening in America, and that's it. And I spent 5 years living in Australia, so I understand that frustration like firsthand of like somebody walking in and just talking about America and assuming that applies everywhere. And that's also been a sweet spot, because a lot of keynote speakers, like, they're very U.S. centric. And if you aren't that way, you can get a lot of good opportunities to present outside of the U.S.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know for me personally, over the last year or two, Evernote's become a great tool for collecting stories that I find, as well as even visual things. I'll take a snapshot of that visual and file it away, and then when I go back to it, I can get inspiration for different things about how I might visually approach something. So it's definitely being able to collect those different aspects. You can collect stories, you can collect jokes or things that are slightly humorous that you can kind of weave into what it is that you're doing. I'm a big fan of hip hop music, so I use the analogy of like sampling different pieces from various sources and kind of pulling it all together in something that's like a remix with your own unique take and spin on it.
Yeah, I'm big on, I call it curation, but it's basically the same thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's, taking lots of stuff. And I use so I use, online methods. I've tried using Evernote. I haven't become like an Evernoter, but I've used it. I use Delicious sometimes. But then I also so I also do this is like total old school. It's like a box with index cards, right? I mean, I use a combination of like the old school stuff and digital tools. And so I'm a digital guy, right? Like I've spent my career working in digital companies and advising companies a lot of times on digital marketing and social media and that kind of stuff. But when it comes to some of these things, like I go analog, right? I mean, I don't like those touchpads. I like my mouse.
It's funny. I've got an app on my iPad that it replicates sticky notes, Post-it notes.
Yeah.
So I've played around with that where it's like, usually I'm writing on a Post-it note and rearranging things. But now I've got an app that I can, type everything on or write everything on and then rearrange the Post-it notes. It's funny that kind of mix between the analog and digital.
Yeah, one of the tricks, I call it a trick. I guess it's just kind of, maybe it's an obvious thing, but a lot of times when I'm going in and working with a client and I'm trying to help them simplify their story, I'll literally walk in with two things. I'll walk in with my like Post-it note and a Sharpie, and I'll say, this is all you got, because with this on here, you can only fit like 3 or 4 words. That's it. And then you run out of space. You can't write really small. Yeah. And so it forces you to like condense what you're thinking into something smaller. And I think sometimes we have to do that because, especially when you really know your subject, it's the curse of knowledge, right? Then from, what the Made to Stick guys talked about in their book, like when you have too much knowledge, then it's very difficult for you to boil it down.
Well, Rohit, we'll have the links to your website, also that blog post that you mentioned about moderating a panel, and your social media profiles, any other resources over at whatthespeak.com in the show notes. I want to thank you so much for your time and for sharing your personal experience, your journey, and some of the great insights that you've gleaned as someone who truly kicks ass when they speak, present, or pitch.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
You bet. If you liked what today's guest had to share in our discussion, you may want to grab an audio copy of their latest book for free by going to WTSaudiobook.com. That's WTSaudiobook.com.
All right, here we go with the outro.
Thanks so much for joining us today on What to Speak. Be sure to visit whatthespeak.com for show notes on every episode and to sign up for our email list to stay updated on resources that'll help you kick ass when you speak, present, or pitch.